We need to talk about APIs a little bit more and understand more about, of course, REST API security. Well, let's find out more right here on IT Pro TV.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
We are diving back in and learning a little bit more about the idea of APIs and REST API security, and we need to know more about it from Anthony Sequeira. So Anthony, as we get started here, right, this is one of the areas that I've teased about, that network automation, programming, that's really not most of our strong suit, but APIs are going to play an important part of our future as we continue to move forward. So help us out here.
Yeah, and what's great is they're going to make it easy for us to do this stuff.
Right.
You know, we don't have to be programmers in order to survive in the new SD world, but APIs were designed to make it easy for us to do this kind of stuff. So embrace this. And if you have API fatigue, it's a real problem.
Yeah.
I don't blame you. And, you know, just buzz through this. If you already know about APIs, maybe even fast forward to the REST API security part. But you know, that's definitely a hazard these days. I don't know if you've felt it, Ronnie, but I'm like getting a little API fatigue. It's like, oh my gosh, if one more person talks to me about REST APIs and how that's saving the world, I'm going to, you know, break something.
Yeah, to me, I guess the terminology is where I really found my first kind of stumbling block. And so let's start with that. Just give us kind of a basic analogy of an API that you would actually use.
Thank you.
And maybe that kind of helps us.
Absolutely. One of the things you see is you're like, okay, what is an API if you don't know? And then you read these definitions that make it sound impossible. I just think of it as it is a simplified way for us to interact with software. That's it. It's an interface into the software. It's simplified commands that we can fire off against a software system that then does things for us. And I wasn't going to do this, but I will do this in this episode. I will show like an example. It's not that hard at all.
Right.
So we got two things to do. Number one is we need to go ahead and really make sure we're solid on a couple of these API concepts. And then also, as Ronnie indicated, a specific objective for us in Encore is to talk about security wrapped around this, because that should always be a concern of ours. We don't want anyone eavesdropping on how we are configuring our gear, whether it's the CLI, SNMP, RESTconf, or a full-blown REST API mode. First of all, the application programming interfaces are now being categorized in a couple of different ways, and this is a very popular one.
Right.
Let's pretend that controller in the middle is Cisco's DNA Center. Great example. So there is applications up at the top, and that would be the DNA Center graphical user interface. And what it's doing is it is sending API calls down to the controller intelligence, and we refer to those as the northbound APIs. And then the DNA Center's controller intelligence is shooting commands down to, in some form, the data plane, and it's the southbound APIs that is the language of love there that is controlling those devices. The reason why you need to break these up into these categories is it could be different APIs in use in the different locations. You could have a system that is using like RESTful APIs up at the top, but then is using some completely different API type down at the bottom. So that's one of the reasons the two are distinguished. I think another good reason to distinguish the two areas too is security. You want to make sure that the APIs in the northbound area are secured, and so are the southbound. So what we love and what you hear so much about because of the popularity of cloud is APIs that are RESTful or REST APIs. And the reason why this is so incredibly popular and is the rage nowadays is because of cloud. Cloud wants to follow web-based models, right? Think about Amazon Web Services. The first time you learn AWS, what do? You go to a web page called the AWS Management Console. I think that's close enough. So you go to this management console of AWS, and it's this big fancy web page, and you just click, 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 and you make all this magic happen inside of AWS. Well, guess what? You are taking advantage of REST APIs that can be communicated over the internet using HTTP and HTTPS. It turns out that in programming, in like specifically anything involving data, which is what we're dealing with, there's CRUD.
Right.
Oh, let me see if I can remember what CRUD stands for. I think, and help me, Ronnie, I bet you know. It's create, read, update, delete.
Yes.
Okay, so create, read, update, delete is something that programmers are like, woo, we got to make sure we can accommodate that with this data technology. And it turns out that HTTP uses just a very similar approach. Think about it. Update is like post.
Right.
And read is like get. And delete is like
Delete.
So it's such a similar model that it really goes hand in hand with what our application developers are trying to accomplish with CRUD. So that's why RESTful APIs are such a great thing.
Yeah, I like the idea of the REST API is actually really neat because if we remember just a little bit earlier than when REST APIs really came out, APIs were really difficult. It required you to learn a particular language. You had to actually understand kind of nuances of those APIs that were there. But using REST, everybody already kind of understood that idea of the HTTP transfer and everything else that's going on. So building that on top makes it easier for anybody to really come along and actually have the same types of things that we would normally need with a very complicated API. So that's why the world of networking, especially, and everything else that we're doing, is starting to say, hey, REST APIs are the way to go. It's so simplified in terms of the way that the things are accomplished. And logically, it's easier to explain than trying to say, here's a SOAP API. Go ahead and try and figure that out as well. So it's very neat. And you see with the 4 simple steps, we understand the process of what's going on.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up SOAP. So SOAP is another approach to APIs that we could take, but we don't because it's much more complicated, as Ronnie alluded to, and it doesn't follow that great HTTP type approach. And something else that is so funny, I just realized. So I said, I wasn't planning on doing this. I was going to go to AWS and do an API in action. But I just remember, Ronnie, when I was creating our presentation today, I decided to build in an example.
Okay.
So there is one right in here. We don't have to jump out to AWS. Now, before we take a look at an example, though, and talk about securing the RESTful API, I wanted to show you this list. I don't like memorization for certification exams. So what I will often do is not do it.
Right.
And let me explain. I get on a test like this, I get really good at BGP and I get really good at OS. I get good at all the configure and verify stuff. And then I can best guess at anything that requires memorization. And I don't care if I miss some of those or not, I still pass. But I got to stop taking shortcuts like that, because one of these days I'm going to fail like the CCIE recert and be out the money. And I got to stop, cutting corners. And if I were to be resetting myself for Encore, honestly, I would make flashcards so that I don't have any stress about passing or failing. I would make flashcards of these if you don't already know them. Why we care so much about the status codes now of HTTP is because that's what we're going to see in response to our RESTful API usage. So when you go to a web browser and you put in the correct URL, the https:// blah, 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 to have some magic happen up there at the software system, you're going to get an HTTP status code. 200 is, woohoo, it worked.
Right.
That's what you want to see. 201 is created. Awesome. So what we wanted to have happen up at the server happened. 400, bad request. So this is most likely that you did not form the syntax the way you needed to. This is some type of problem. And the 400 indicates that it's not with the server, actually. It is with the client. So the client is not doing it right. And the client is typically us at the management station. 401 means you had a security failure.
Yeah.
Authentication probably failed.
By far. Yeah.
Yep. 403, what do you think that is? Forbidden. What would you think? Yeah, how about you tried to do something you're not allowed to do?
Yeah.
Notice it's different from 401, isn't it? 401's like you probably were supposed to give username and password credentials and you gave incorrect ones. 403 is you probably authenticated just fine, but you tried to do something that you're not permitted to do. And then one we all know.
Right.
And you would never get asked this one, unfortunately, darn it, because Cisco knows you know it, is a 404. We all know the 404 is
not found.
Yeah, what you were looking for isn't there. We've all seen that classic. We used to see it in web browsers, right? 404 not found. I think now web browsers like dress that up, and they realize the average person doesn't know what a 404 error code is. So it'll be a nice warm fuzzy message like the web page isn't there. But that's one that, we all probably know.
Yeah. Now, with that list, I want to kind of emphasize something for just a moment, if you don't mind. The very fact is, on the CCNA, you need to know just a little bit more than just those two. And that's because what you see there is actually great, because it shows us the idea of the server-side responses, the 200s that you mentioned, and then the 400s, usually the client-side responses. You still have that same thing, but make sure you also know the 500s that are out there, which is normally bad gateway, which tells you that device on the other end, something is wrong. So another type of server-side response that's really bad. And you have an unknown one, which is the 300s. You're not sure whether it's your side or my side. We just know something is wrong. So I would pay attention to that as well. Not saying, but Anthony and I have actually talked about it a little bit, okay, that it may be that we're sharing question pools between those exams. So just kind of realize that you may get more than just those 200s and those 400s.
I like it. Now, Ronnie, do you have a kind of a guide to, is there a web page that you've used that kind of breaks those down?
Yes, you can actually go to W3 Schools and find out those HTTP response codes.
Perfect.
And we also have our Cisco DevNet course, and we also have the CCNA, which are the programmability and automation side. We go over those same response codes too.
Yeah, and I love what you said there. I gave you the list that, in fact, the Encore certification guide, this was the list they emphasized. I looked at this list of HTTP status codes and I'm like, yep, that'll cover the exam. But like Ronnie pointed out, they expanded on this in CCNA, and it's very likely that they would borrow questions. Yeah. There seems to be that going on now with these next level certs where, they're just kind of, this question would fit in any 5 of these tests, so it could be a possibility. So yeah, that's great, Ronnie. I'll even take a look at those because, like I said, I want to get better at doing some of the memorization, because why should I ask my students to do it if I'm not willing to do it myself? So when it comes to securing our APIs, what an important topic. There's 3 approaches that are often taken. And the first one you look at and go, basic HTTP? Yeah, it is possible that you keep things super simple. This is often a username and password that is going to be used as the credentials for the system. But much more commonly in environments where we really want to have a higher degree of security, you'll see OAuth. That's hugely popular. That's a security mechanism that you can use for your REST APIs, which gives you higher levels of security and can really easily identify a user for authentication. And then there's token-based systems. And I am going to show you an example now, as I promised, to try and bring all of this together for you. So here is an example of a RESTful API in action that includes security. So the method, the HTTP method that we're using is POST. The URL is our APIC EM controller. And then notice it is an API location up on the server system, v1, so that obviously there could be multiple versions of the API. We're using v1, and it is a particular piece of software up there called user that we're calling. This is to create a user account.
Right.
There's custom headers in this web request that we're doing, and there's a content type, and notice we're going to be using JSON, and then there's an XAuth token. This is clearly the token-based security that we're doing for the RESTful API. And then what's in the body? The body of this is the JSON. And we will be teaching you JSON here in Encore, just in case you don't already know it. And the JSON is a nice, simple, easy to read data representation format. And in this case, it gives all of the details that create the user account. So I hope now this makes a lot of sense if you're new to APIs. You can see what we're doing here. We're using the web, HTTP, a RESTful API, and we are giving all of the information needed to create a user account, and that information is in the body of this message in JSON format. And as far as the security goes, we're using an authentication token approach, and the custom headers of HTTP enable us to include that information.
Yeah, this is kind of neat that you showed us this, because not only can we do this along with programs that actually allow us to use those APIs, like Postman that's out there, which is a great program. I recommend you take a look at it and take some of those examples that they give you so that you can run this. But with the way that the RESTful APIs work and that Northbound API works, we can not only have to use programs like that, but we can go in with Python and actually write out that entire request, just like you showed there, and do the same thing. So that API gives us that variety that we actually want to be able to have, depending on how good that you are with the idea of whether you're more development side of things or whether you're actually more, like I am, more application bound. These are actually very helpful for us. So the use of these APIs and being able to actually have the security that we need are important. Security, of course, matters more when we have unsecured networks that we're going across.
Yep.
Whereas internally, if I'm doing that, basic auth might be just enough. But out on the internet, we might consider that idea of the token. We might consider that idea of OAuth too, right?
Yep.
Or OAuth as well. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, Anthony, is there anything else that you would add to this?
I guess, you just really made me think of it, Ronnie. It's so cool what this world does offer for us. I gave the example of AWS. And let me just talk for one more moment about that. So one of the things these APIs that's so cool about them is the flexibility that it gives us. So I mentioned when you're learning something like AWS, you start with the management console. It's a graphical user interface. But really quickly in my use of AWS, I migrated away from that because guess what? I love the CLI. That's what I'm used to with Cisco. That's my passion. And sure enough, there is an AWS CLI, and I can do things so much faster with it. If I want to see my S3 buckets, I don't want to have to log in to my management console and then navigate. Where's S3? There's S3. Where's my buckets? There are my buckets. I can go to the CLI, type AWS S3 -list, and it fires off the appropriate API call for me and lists all my S3 buckets. So APIs really are pretty cool. Avoid API fatigue and just embrace how cool this is. And as Ronnie indicated, go up to the DevNet. They have Postman instructions on how you can play with APIs inside of that cool application, and you can really get how this works by doing examples.
All right, well, that's a great wrap up for us. So let's go ahead and sign off then. For IT Pro TV, I'm your host, Ronnie Wong.
And I'm Anthony Sequeira.
Stay tuned right here for more of your CCNP Encore show.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.